I'm not sure that in a country where inequality may well be the highest in the world, and in the light of Piketty's recent analysis, which I think is rather convincing, would a country like South Africa want to necessarily copy the tax structure which exists in the more industrialized countries? And I would think not. And indeed, as you proceeded, you mentioned a number of possible tax reforms that would be quite different from those existing in industrialized countries. Now, my second point is that in your analysis, and of course by necessity, your general equilibrium model cannot capture the feedback from any change in poverty, any change in inequality back to growth. And again, in the light of what I would call the new political economy of development, that essentially makes a strong case that increasing inequality can retard growth. This is something that you certainly should keep in mind, and again, in a country where inequality is endemic and does not appears to be going down, but very slowly, you should keep this in mind. And then finally, I haven't seen the 2012 social accounting matrix for South Africa, but I assume that you have a certain number of socioeconomic group, different categories based on rural, urban, level of education, level of skill. And what I would encourage you to do is to use the existing surveys, and South Africa has very good surveys, to get the initial income distribution within each one of those socioeconomic groups. So this gives you the baseline in terms of the initial income distribution. And then, as you proceed to promote certain tax changes, see if you cannot endogenously come up with the new income distribution, which of course, once you set up your poverty line, would give you the new poverty outcome. And I think that with a combination of general equilibrium model, micro simulation, with the appropriate feedbacks, you might be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I'm very thankful that all the technical problems landed in your session rather than mine. It made my life a lot easier than it has made yours. Just a quick observation. It follows on from something that Eric said and came out in your presentation, which was these very weak growth effects that you were pointing to with the transfer schemes, and indeed through other tax reforms you were looking at. And I suppose I wanted to push you a little bit further on that. To what extent is this really telling us more about the model than about reality here? That the class of model that you're using, as far as I can tell, is probably not going to generate big growth effects under a whole range of public finance reforms. I don't, as far as I can see, what it's going to do is at the margin change factor accumulation. There will be a little bit of labor supply effects and something happening with the rate of capital accumulation, but it's not getting at deeper mechanisms of growth here, which you may, when you think about South Africa rather than thinking about the model, believe may be more important. So I'd be quite keen to hear your thoughts on how confident you are about this quite strong finding on the growth side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation, but there are some things that bother me. And to follow up with what Eric said in terms of the nature of the tax system, I'm usually worried whenever we are doing a study on Africa and we start talking about how close to global standards or how close to Western standards some institutions are, primarily because those institutions that are developed, say, in the European Union or in the US, are developed for, or rather, developed to meet certain objectives that exist over there. The objectives that South Africa has may have absolutely nothing to do with what the tax system in the US or in the European Union countries are designed to do. So the question I want you to look at as you develop your study is how did South Africa come up with its tax system? And in doing so, did that tax system meet any of the 40 principles that were developed when South Africa was developing its constitution in 1994? Since that those principles were supposed to, were designed to meet certain objectives, taking into consideration the history through which South Africa has gone into. And there was one thing that I saw in your presentation, and that was you mentioned that one of the committees or commissions had suggested or mandated that the tax system be changed from one based on income to place of residence. I don't know whether that is what the tax system is at the moment, but I don't know how that figures into the severe inequalities that you have in South Africa with respect to the distribution of land, whether or not the tax system takes that into consideration, because if you're not looking at that as an important factor, then you're missing the fact that the severe inequalities in the distribution of land already puts into place a situation in which some people are going to continuously have a wealth advantage over others, and that would have present a very major problem for the government if the government is basically looking at taxation of income or imposing taxes on people based on where they live within the country. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ernest. I know that people from the audience, commenters, are not supposed to comment on other people from the audience, but let me make a small exception to that. Sort of in defense of what Ramos is doing, I'm not completely familiar with the structure of your model, but I have a sense of, a dynamic general equilibrium model. This is really something that Eric said, which was that that you cannot have an effect of changes in income distribution feeding back onto real growth in a dynamic CGE model. That's not true. I mean, that in fact, it's done all the time, that you change income distribution, there are different marginal products of labor, different rates of time preference, different income groups have different optimization problems, and you generate changes. They may not be very big changes, but in fact you can, and in a sense any model that has a true dynamic optimization will have a feedback from distributional changes caused by, say, the tax code or anything else into income growth. So I don't know, as I say, I don't know if that's the way your model works, but.
Yes, yours?
Thank you. Very interesting study. I look forward actually to reading the full paper so I can have more detail. But I just wanted for you to clarify a couple of things. One, putting into the study in the context of a country with high unemployment rate, high inequality, sluggish growth, and also declining and low public investment. So that's the way I see South Africa broadly. Now, one thing you said is that increasing the corporate tax rate is bad for growth. I mean, it reduces per capita GDP. So I wanted to know what mechanisms do you get that result? Is it through a growth channel, an investment channel, an employment channel? I don't know how that result comes out. The other point I wanted you to clarify is the linkages between progressivity of the tax system and growth, and you say it actually it's bad for growth. But when I think about what you're proposing, for example, recycling VAT through transfers, if you do that correctly, that makes the tax system progressive. How consistent is this with your proposition that progressivity is bad for growth? The other thing, the other point is about the point made by John about the changes from source-based to residence-based taxation. But I want to link this to illicit financial flows. How does that affect the country's effort to curb capital flight and illicit financial flows? Thanks.
Ramos, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot to my discussant, Professor Boyton. The cleaning up of the paper will certainly do that when we approach the final aspects of the paper. Also write up the methodology much more clearly. What we didn't want to do here was to bore people with equations, but to really stick to the essential mechanisms that are driving our results. I'll share with you the codes and the equations underlying the paper. I think an important point that you raise is why we haven't reported on a simulation which zero rates social goods as the poverty and inequality reduction driver. Well, currently, if you talk to South African policymakers, they will tell you that that's what the status quo actually is. Foodstuffs and paraffin are currently zero rated. Your proposal is to raise tax rates on luxury goods over and above the current system. Do I think South Africa should go that route? My answer will probably be no. And the reason for that is essentially the marginal excess burden story that I spoke to. When you raise taxes on luxury goods much higher than where they currently are, one, the rate is going to go so much up, and that would naturally encourage some forms of evasion and inefficiencies loaded into the system. When we're doing some sensitivities around the model, if you try to differentiate the products covered by the VAT and institute differential treatment, too wide differential treatment of those products, much of what you pick up is the rising inefficiencies from that exercise. So what we rely on here is we have a well-established VAT system that is so efficient over time as it currently stands. So we don't talk, we don't want to mess with a system that's working, but want to use it, to convert that strength that it has as a revenue generating device into addressing a social. That's why we don't want to change too much the setup of the VAT system, because you may actually end up with a worse system than we currently have. So my views on it will be, it's really about harnessing the strength of the current system through a recycling procedure. Then, as I said, do I think the zero rating is working? Yes, it's working, but it tends to benefit rich households and individuals, if not more, but just as much as it benefits poor people. So there is some mistargeting of the system in the current setup, but we take those inefficiencies and the increases in VAT rates that we talk about, assume that the status quo, where you're zero rating foodstuffs and paraffin, continue. A second set of issues may be, and I alluded to that, suppose you reduce zero rating. The usual argument is that it's good for poverty and it's good along gender dimensions. Well, if you've got such a fantastic targeting system that can recycle to the poor households to the gender dimensions that you want to catch, why do it using such a blunt instrument like a zero rating, when you, to a rough approximation, you know who these people on 350 or less than 350 rands are, and they are in some mechanized system already. Department of Social Development is working with these people through other transfers that it does on child support grants, other sorts of grants. So the system is set up already to identify that group. So if the argument of this paper here is use this big, nice engine which generates so much revenue efficiently to address poverty directly, and you don't have to build any much technological platform for that redistribution. So it's much more direct than relying on a blanket approach that benefits both extremely rich households and extremely poor households, because extremely rich households also consume eggs, they consume mealie meal, they consume all the nice foodstuffs that are zero rated by the current system. So it does appear to be a strange system to perpetuate into the future, especially when you've built so much technology at identifying who the poor people really are. Then Andrew, thanks for addressing the issues from Professor Thobeck and part of Chris. Now, Chris, the issue of to what extent is what we are reporting in artifact or reality? That's in my opinion, a question that all of us modelers should really be asking ourselves every time we run these kinds of exercises. And my sense, and this is why I was quite explicit to say, I'm not recommending specific tax policy here, I'm recommending directions. And why I think this is not an artifact is, one, we've carried out sensitivity analysis. Two, we are quite clear that right at the back of the growth model behind our model is a neoclassical type growth model. And there, what you are going to affect is the level of output rather than the rate of growth output, except in the transition. And as I said, the 10 transitions that I've picked up here are, you can think of those as short-run equilibria, but connected over the 10-year period, paired with sensitivity analysis to say, hey, if this is an artifact, it's an interesting artifact which applies for a wide range of assumptions about the value of the rate and other assumptions around elasticities. And we take the elasticities in the model as underlying behavioral parameters of how typical South Africa behaves.